This is another iROAR podcast.
Everything is connected. So ethology is basically the study of animal behavior. And so, ethology, as I'm saying, ethology, ecology are very, very connected because obviously, species don't exist in isolation of their habitat. So that's why instead of saying that I'm an ethologist, though I've been trained in animal behavior, I prefer to say that I'm a behavioral ecologist because I'm actually studying animals in the wild. Right. So, and I see that behaviors change. Behaviors are quite plastic. The same dog can behave differently in different, say, seasons. For example, when it's mating season or when it's pup rearing season, a dog can become more aggressive than it is at other times. So, behavior is affected by habitat, behavior is affected by seasons, behavior is affected by its internal state, its hormones, everything, right? So everything put together would be the behavioral ecology of the animal.
Welcome back to The Animal Turn, everyone. This is Season 7, Episode 4. In this season, we're focused on animals and multi-species health, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about behavioral ecology. This episode is sponsored by the Remaking One Health Indies project, or RO Indies project, and in today's episode, I speak to Anindita Bhadra, who is a behavioral ecologist working with free-ranging dogs in India. Anindita founded the Dog Lab at the Department of Biological Sciences, the Indian Institute of Science Education and Research in Kolkata in June 2009, and has since then been doing a whole host of work with free-roaming dogs. And she's written widely and extensively about it too in leading journals such as PLOS ONE, Animal Cognition, as well as Ethology, Ecology, and Evolution. Our conversation today is immensely interesting. There's a lot that we talk about where I'd never really even thought about dogs in that way. What happens when we start to view dogs through the lens of ecology instead of through sort of pet lenses? It's really, really interesting, and I hope you enjoy the show. It's lovely to have you on the show. I'm very excited to talk to you today about behavioral ecology. It's one of these concepts that gets said a lot, but I'm not exactly sure I understand what it means. So I'm really excited to learn from you a bit about it today. Perhaps we could start with learning a bit about you first and some of the work you do and how you came to be interested in ecology.
Yeah, hi, Claudia. Nice to be here. So I call myself a behavioral ecologist. I work on the behavior, ecology, cognition of dogs. Free-ranging dogs, to be precise, or what people often call street dogs or stray dogs in India. My interest in the subject started when I was in college during my undergrad days, when we were introduced to the subject for the first time by a new teacher. And then we were taken on a field excursion to the south of India, to the Western Ghats. In fact, on the way, we were taken to the Indian Institute of Science, the oldest science institute in India, and we visited the Center for Ecological Sciences. We got a glimpse of research in ecology and behavior through several talks and lab visits. And I was thoroughly fascinated by the kind of work that people were doing. Some people were studying elephants in the forest and trying to reduce human-animal conflict. Others were looking at long-term ecosystems. And then I think the most inspirational talk we heard by Professor Raghavendra Gadakkar, who talked to us about social lives of insects. And then we visited his lab where he was working on social wasps. And I came back and I remember telling my friends, I want to go back and do my PhD in that lab. And that's kind of how it all started. And then I actually followed up by reading this fantastic book called Survival Strategies, which is written by Professor Gadakkar. And it's targeted towards undergrads, and where he talks about survival strategies in different animals and plants. And that, again, kept my interest going in the field. And eventually, after my master's, I went and joined the PhD program at IIC. Thankfully, I cleared the exam, and I started my PhD in the research group of Professor Gadakkar.
Wow, and you started looking at wasps, right? Wasp ecology.
Yes.
What does that entail? What does it mean to look at wasp ecologies?
Well, I was not particularly looking at their ecology because we would bring nests from the field and bring them to the lab and keep them in the lab environment. but we were looking at their behavior, and we were interested in the social behavior of these wasps, because these are social wasps which build a nest, which have a queen and workers just like honeybees and ants. And I like to say that I was studying wasp politics, because I was trying to understand who is the next queen when this queen is still present. Do the wasps have a hierarchy decided of succession, and how do they understand who the next queen is, and what will happen if the next queen is not there? Is there a next to next queen? And I was also trying to understand how the queen maintains her dominance in the colony, because she doesn't use aggression, and we happen to show that she actually uses chemical communication a lot. So that was what my PhD was about. And what it meant was that you go collect these wasp nests, and of course wasps do sting, so you have to be very careful, and bring them back to the lab, get them habituated to live in these wire mesh boxes, and they very soon get adapted. They find their way in and out of this cage, and we have a lab where it's open so that they can go out, get food, and come back. And then we had to mark each wasp with a combination of unique colors using this particular non-toxic paint, so that each wasp has a name which is color coded. For example, a wasp with a red and yellow dot would be called RY. And so each wasp in the colony, it could be a colony of 30 wasps, it could be a colony of 100 wasps, but each had a unique identity. And then we record their behavior. Record means, you visually sit down and write everything which is happening in tedious detail, and for hours and days. And then we often did a lot of manipulative experiments depending on the questions that we were addressing. So this is what I was doing during my PhD.
Wow. And do you still do lab work today? I know that you've switched now from looking at wasps in these environments to focusing on dogs now, right?
Yeah. And no, we don't do any lab work now. So all our work is out there on the streets where the dogs live. Often, people come into the lab and say, okay, this is the dog lab. Where are the dogs? And I'm like, right outside. So, yeah, all our work is in the field.
Wow. And why the switch? Why not do something similar with dogs that you did with wasps, where you bring them into the lab environments and look at their behaviors? What's important or significant about looking at dogs?
Yeah, that's a nice question. So, a lot of people actually study dogs in the lab environment where they look at pet dogs. So owners bring their dogs to the labs, and these dogs are put through experiments. But then for me, the most pertinent question was, how did dogs become dogs? Because when you study pets, then you are already looking at dogs which have been brought up by humans, lived in the human household, are being taken care of humans. So they are already in this very, very artificial environment. But then dogs have not always been pets. There have been times in the past where they have gradually been domesticated from whatever their wilder ancestors, wolf-like ancestors were, to become the dogs that we have today. Of course, we know that the breeds are man-made. But even before we started breeding dogs, we did have dogs as pets and domestic animals. So this transition is very fascinating for me. And to me, it was a big question of, understanding how dogs behave or adapt to living around humans without having humans to take care of them or to train them. And that is why I felt that the free-ranging dogs are this fascinating model system which people aren't studying, because these are dogs which are living in nature. They have their own lives, they have their own societies, they have their own systems of living, and they are exposed to all the disturbances in nature, all the struggles that any other species in the wild goes through. So they have to find their food, they have to struggle against disease, all of this. So any species which is out there in the wild and the dogs which are out there on the streets are no different in terms of the ecosystem or in terms of their ecology and behavior. So these need to be studied, need to be understood to really understand how dogs live their own lives when they are not being pampered by humans. What is their natural behavior? What is it that dogs did before they became pets? So even if I try to understand the trajectory of the dog-human relationship, then they give us this glimpse of when dogs were living around humans, were not taken into their bedrooms, and they had a relationship of coexistence with humans. So that is why I study the dogs which are on the streets. And then for me, if I bring them into the lab, again, I create an artificial environment, which is not what we are interested in.
That's fascinating. So do you find when thinking about dogs' ecology, and I know that most dogs in the world, people have this idea that most dogs in the world are actually pet dogs, but that's not the case at all. Most dogs in the world are free roaming or street dogs. So we should be interested in looking at those dogs. But when it comes to thinking about a dog's ecology, is it that humans are a vital part of that ecology? Or do you find instances where there are dogs who are living and forming their own colonies and their own relationships, regardless of humans? Or is there some sort of really tight connection between human environments and dog environments?
Yes, there is. So, in fact, dogs are where humans are. In fact, it's very fascinating, here, if you travel in the hills, in the mountains, where there are villages and then there are long stretches of roads where there are no villages. You would know that there's a village coming because you see a dog somewhere on the street. And then soon there'll be a village, and you cross the village, very soon you're going to see no dogs. So, the dogs are always hanging around where humans live. There are some cases where dogs are now being reported to form large packs and hunt wildlife in many of the forests in India, which is becoming a major conflict situation. But then if you go back and look at the history, basically what has happened is dogs have come with tourists. There are these tourist bungalows on the fringes of the forest, or there are villages on the fringes of the forest, and people have fed them, and then the dogs have been left behind. And now what they're doing is they're forming packs and hunting wildlife. So the dogs were not originally there. These are dogs which have followed some humans and then been left there for whatever reason. So usually the dogs live around humans. They depend largely on our excess food, our garbage for their livelihood. Typically dogs, these free-ranging dogs, are not good hunters. Only when it comes to these kinds of situations in forest fringes. Sometimes we get these reports from villages which are close to more wilder areas away from cities, where you will hear that there's a pack of dogs which has killed a goat. But often they do it only at times when there is a scarcity of food. And other than that, they are mostly scavengers in the garbage, and they prefer to be around humans.
I know so many breeds of dogs have been bred for hunting, but actually when you said that, packs of dogs hunting, I think part of my imagination about a hunting dog is in a very kind of human-centric way, right? Humans that have bred dogs to hunt in a very particular circumstance or situation, but not dogs necessarily hunting in and of themselves. So that's a really fascinating case study. But you mentioned there that dogs were left to their own devices. So while they might be kind of dependent on human environments, they tend to use those environments for scavenging purposes. Are there other animals that are similar in ecological terms to dogs when it comes to this type of behavior? So a close relationship to humans, but it doesn't have to be this pet kind of relationship, but they are using humans as a resource for our waste and our food.
Yes, lots. In fact, recently we published a study where we were asking this question, that are there other animals in the urban habitats especially who are using our food? And it was very interesting because we found a lot of birds who are using this leftover food very efficiently. So there were hyenas, there were crows, of course. Then very surprisingly, we got some bulbuls and in some cases drongos. So several birds which are capable of using leftover food as a resource. And of course, we do have stray cats. Sometimes in some places, goats and cows which are straying, these would also come and feed in the garbage. So there are a lot of animals which are relying on human garbage. And of course, what you don't see very easily, but they're there, they're the rats.
Yeah, I think of foxes, and if I'm not mistaken, some foxes, urban foxes in around European cities are starting to show physical changes that are often attributed with domestication, floppier ears, etc. And it's been challenging for me to think through, because oftentimes when we think of domestication, we think of humans intentionally breeding animals to create a specific type of animal. But it seems here that it doesn't necessarily have to be intentionally done by humans, that some animals who exploit human habitats or human dominant habitats start to show domesticated features. How does that work?
In fact, currently, most people who work on dogs have come to this conclusion that probably dogs are self-domesticated. So, this idea that, somebody took some wolf pups home and made them into dogs is becoming more and more outdated. And we are understanding that it's probably the dogs who initiated the process, following around maybe hunter-gatherer groups for the scraps, and eventually the process of domestication started. So if that could have happened, and if the dogs are self-domesticated, it's also possible for other species. In fact, here we have jackals, and there are some reports from areas where habitation has increased more and more and has become more and more urbanized. People are saying that they're seeing jackals. Morning walkers are encountering jackals, which are foraging in the garbage, and sometimes the jackals can get aggressive if there are multiple of them. And usually jackals don't come out in packs. They are solitary foragers, right? But then people are seeing 4 or 5 jackals together in a garbage and bin, and then they are actually chasing humans. So could be, again, a domestication process on the way, because the jackal's natural habitat is being destroyed, and they are now trying to use human leftovers as a source of food. Could be possible.
So what then, I don't quite understand. So what is self-domestication? What is domestication then?
So domestication would be this final process where animals are living with humans, right? So, and initially this term was coined for the process which is initiated by humans, where you take animals and kind of adopt them and make them live next to you. But these cases are making us think again. So the idea is, if these animals are using us as resources, and their behavior, morphology, everything is gradually changing. Because one of the things that's very well understood is that domestication causes not just morphological changes, but certain behavioral traits like more friendliness or less aggressiveness are preferred traits when it's domestication, right? So obviously a person would be more comfortable around a dog than a wolf. Simple as that. So probably some genetic changes where the selection for less aggressive traits or more friendly traits would push animals towards domestication if they are utilizing human resources more and more. So that is the idea.
Well, this is fascinating. So it starts to make domestication sound to me like an evolutionary concept, right? Because you could have domestication that is selective, where humans are and continue to select specific animals, interbreed them to make and try to produce specific traits. And of course, this happens in lab experiments. It happens for agricultural animals. This kind of intentional breeding is part of a domestication process. But it seems as though domestication is also something, if humans are valuable, if humans and human environments are valuable to an animal, that domestication could be thought of in evolutionary terms. And I know evolution is important to behavioral ecology. So maybe we could take a step back here and could you tell me, what is behavioral ecology? How is it different? How does it relate to this kind of ecology universe? What does it mean?
Behavioral ecology, if you think about it, it is basically how the different behaviors that a species show influence its survival, and how in different contexts you can see different behaviors changing, the adaptations that you see, which could be based on a habitat. So animal behavior as a field, and then when you put an ecology together, you don't see behavior in isolation as just the behavior itself, but you put behavior in the context of the ecosystem, in the context of the animal's environment. You have behavioral ecology. So, for example, if I am trying to understand species, say, mating habits, right? And I'm trying to just look at, okay, in this species, the females prefer males of this kind. But on the other hand, if I'm also looking at, okay, is there variation in the mating habits in different habitats? Or does this preference make more sense if I look at the habitat in which the species lives? So is there a connection of the ecology of the species with the behaviors that I'm looking at? So you don't look at a behavior in isolation like in the lab, but you look at the behavior in its ecological concept.
How does this differ from ethology or something like multi-species ethnography, or are they connected?
Everything is connected. So ethology is basically the study of animal behavior. And so, ethology, as I'm saying, ethology, ecology are very, very connected, because obviously, species don't exist in isolation of their habitat. So that's why, instead of saying that I'm an ethologist, though I've been trained in animal behavior, I prefer to say that I'm a behavioral ecologist, because I'm actually studying animals in the wild. Right. So, and I see that behaviors change. Behaviors are quite plastic. The same dog can behave differently in different, say, seasons. For example, when it's mating season or when it's pup rearing season, a dog can become more aggressive than it is at other times. So behavior is affected by habitat, behavior is affected by seasons, behavior is affected by its internal state, its hormones, everything, right? So everything put together would be the behavioral ecology of the animal.
And with your dogs that you've been looking at, how long have you been looking at free-roaming dogs, and where are you looking at and understanding these relationships?
My lab is around 15 years old. So I started the dog lab in 2009 June when I joined iROAR Kolkata. And iROAR Kolkata is located near the city of Kolkata in India, so eastern part of India. So most of the field work is done in this area, Kolkata, nearby suburbs. Now we are also spreading out into rural areas. But there are studies in which we have done this across India, where we have sampled in different cities across the country to understand whether what we are seeing in Bengal also reflects in other parts of the country. There are studies where we have collected data from different parts, because we have had students posted in different parts of the country and they have collected data, and we have collated this and looked at all of that together. So it's basically India with a greater focus here because the lab is here in West Bengal.
And what kind of features are you finding in looking in dogs in these? I mean, this is a massive question, but what 15 years of work, what have you found? But when it comes to thinking, because this is fascinating, because you're now thinking about dogs as wild, perhaps liminal animals to some extent. And this is a very different conceptual way for us, I think, of thinking about dogs. And by us, I mean, many folks, again, think of dogs as pets, but this is a lot born of the environments that you grow up in. So I grew up in South Africa, where we do have these kinds of pet relationships with dogs, but we also have many free-roaming street dogs, particularly found in informal settlements. So it's quite obvious to me, as someone in that environment, that there are various types of dogs engaged in various types of relationships. But then I go to Canada, and the idea of a free-roaming or free-ranging dog is near, like it's somehow the idea that if a dog is free-roaming, they are unhealthy, they are unsafe, they cannot possibly live good lives. And then you go to other environments where it's quite obvious that there are many free-roaming dogs. So is it the case that if you have a free-roaming dog, they are just unhealthy and living miserable lives? Is that the case?
Absolutely not. Dogs have very, very interesting social lives of their own. So they typically live in family groups. And what we found was that mothers are very caring. In fact, they are investing a lot of their time and energy in caring for their pups. And as the pups grow, they reduce this investment and gradually wean them, but still keep paying attention to their well-being for a long time. We found that there are males in the groups who would sometimes care for pups, and the mothers would allow these males to come to the pups while blocking out other males of the group. There are grandmothers, older sisters, aunts, so female relatives of the pups who would also add to the care given by the mother. So it's like a joint family system. There are very interesting dynamics in terms of when they are feeding. There would be one who would come first and get the lion's share. So if you give them food, then usually there would be one who would approach first. And it almost seems like the others know that there is a hierarchy, and we are still struggling to understand how this hierarchy is determined, because we don't know yet, and that makes it more fascinating, because We see that this happens all the time. And it's not that this individual who comes first to eat would also be first in everything else. So, this typical notion that there's an alpha and this alpha is the leader and this alpha gets to mate with everyone and this alpha does most of the defense. It's nothing like that. So when you look at behaviorally, it's not that the alpha is most aggressive, but somehow they seem to know, So there is something very interesting going on in these dynamics, and that's something that we are trying to do through long-term studies.
So this, it makes me, as you were talking, I was thinking about some of the language that we use to describe other wild populations, right? And you were speaking there about grandmothers and sisters. And so it seems, are they, when dogs have an opportunity to self-organize, do they tend to organize in matrilineal groups? Does that seem to be the case?
It's very, very variable. There would be groups where there are, the mother and her daughters together, maybe with one male. There would be groups which are all male. So it's very variable. It's not like the elephants, neither like the lions. So it's very much more like a human family. You have all kinds of families. It's very much like that.
And in terms of puppies staying with the mother, because again, it's so common in our societies, in many societies, to take puppies away from their mothers very young so that we can socialize them as pets, in effect, right? And this makes me think, well, how long should or would a puppy stay with their mother if they were given the choice to do that? And it seems bizarre that we don't know the answer to this, but what is the case? If they can, how long do puppies normally stick together and stick with their moms?
Quite long, actually. So the weaning window that we have identified, both through behavioral observations and experiments, is 8th to 13th week. So the weaning process typically starts around the end of the 7th week of pup age and goes on till the end of the 14th week, by when the pups are also no longer trying to suckle and the mother is at peace. But they're still hanging around with the mother. In fact, this is the time when the mother is taking them around and feeding with them or bringing them pieces of food, almost like it feels like, to use a very anthropomorphic term, that she's teaching them what to eat and how to eat, literally. So, in fact, they go in steps. So initially the puppies are very small, and when they're 5 weeks or 6 weeks old, she'll start regurgitating semi-solid food for them. And then she will start dropping food in front of them, or if somebody gives food, she'll stand back and let them eat. And then will come a time when she will try to snatch food away from them, which is when they're 10, 11 weeks older. She'll also try to compete with them. And eventually, they will start going out to forage with adults, not just the mother, but sometimes with the male also. They'll go out to forage in groups and they'll feed together. But then there will also be competition from time to time. And probably this is also a phase of their learning when they know how to face all of this. And most often as adults, they will just stay back in the same group, but then some would disperse in the mating season.
And do mating pairs stay together? Or do you find that year on year or in different mating seasons they'll be?
No, not really. So this is a promiscuous mating system. Males and females both mate with different partners, but we are also seeing mate guarding by males to some extent. In fact, right now, one of my youngest PhD students is looking at the mating dynamics, because until now, we've not collected long-term data on mating behavior. We have short-term data. But we do see mate guarding by males from time to time. We see a lot of fights over mating, because females fight with females to get access to a male. Males fight with males to get access to a female. Typically, they're very territorial, but in the mating season, males will cross territorial boundaries to go mate with different groups, female, and come back. When the inmates of that territory, if they're there, they're going to fight with this incoming male. But the females, very interestingly, will allow this male to come in. So if a male moves into a territory when the male of that territory, the males from that territory are not there, they have also gone roaming off, then the females are quite eager to mate with this foreign male. So it's a very, very dynamic and a very, very messy system.
And do we know what the males and females in these situations are looking for? What kind of traits are they interested in? Or
No, not yet. Not yet, but maybe 5 years down the line, we'll have some idea.
Oh, it's so interesting, the work you do, because again, we've applied different languages and different lenses to thinking somehow about like wild animals and the animals that we've conceived of as pets. And we know so much about the mating behavior and the general, and not to, I mean, again, we've got to be careful to like essentialize these behaviors, but we know so much about wild animal behaviors, and yet somehow dogs were arguably one of the animals we've got the longest relationships with over time. We don't know some of this kind of basic information about them, which is really interesting.
In fact, when I started working, often people would ask me, what is there to know about dogs? Don't we know everything about them? And I was like, well, I don't think so. Let's wait and see. And we see that, no, we don't really know everything about them yet. There's a lot more to understand. In fact, a very big part of our work focuses on dog-human interactions. And it's fascinating looking at these dogs, how well they understand humans without any training, because we often do experiments where people have done similar experiments in the lab with training and then trials, but we cannot train them. So what we do is we try to understand ad hoc what is the kind of population level response in these experiments. For example, do they follow pointing, or would they prefer to eat from a stranger's hand or take food from the ground? So there's no training. They are completely interacting with the experimenter for the first time. For this, we go to different areas for each experiment, for each trial, and the way they respond, it's very fascinating that they can really understand our gestures. They can follow pointing. They can understand the difference between a raised hand and a raised stick. They can understand who is a friendly person and who's not a friendly person by a simple gesture of petting on the head. So it's really amazing that you basically see that as they are developing in this human-dominated habitat, they are learning. They are learning in their own way about our species, and they understand us, they know us much better than we know them.
That was going to be my next question. To what extent do we, because it seems like they watch us, whether free roaming or pet dogs, they watch us constantly to figure out what's happening next. But I'm not too sure that we are necessarily as good at watching them, which is fascinating. It says something about our own kind of ecologies and capacities, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very fascinating for me to think that we are sharing an ecosystem, right? And for most people, it's quite obvious when I have students for the first time. So what I usually do is I tell them, go and do what we call ad libitum observations. Just go sit in front of a group of dogs and write down whatever you see. And initially, students would often come back and say, they're not doing anything. And I say, only a dead animal cannot do anything. So even if you're sleeping, you're doing something, right? Sleeping is a behavior. And then after this coaxing, the amount of details that they come back with, and then they say, oh my God, I am a dog lover and I thought I knew everything about dogs and I've never seen them do this before. So I think as a species, we are less observant because, we kind of take in a lot of information at a very global level instead of going into the specifics of it, because that is how we have survived. But for the dogs, I guess we are very important because we are their source of food. We are their source of shelter because they would often be taking shelter outside human homes, under our cars, under somebody's shed, etc. And we are also their biggest enemies, right? We are the top predators. So they need to watch us for both ends, both for the food and for the stick. So they learn more about us and our behavior and these subtle body language gestures probably than we learn about them by seeing them every day on our streets.
Yeah, it's definitely points to a different kind of power dynamic, right? You tend to watch, when you look at employees, tend to know a lot more what their boss is doing, or let's say service providers in a restaurant, waiters tend to be a lot more aware of the manager. I don't know, maybe that analogy doesn't necessarily work, but I think, those in the bottom of a hierarchy tend to have to look up and know what's going on further up than those that are near the top. And something that's interesting about your work as well, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but the idea of viewing cities as ecosystems is also relatively new. Even though they're pretty dynamic and one of the fastest growing ecosystems in the world, for a long time, ecologists didn't view cities as significant places with which to understand wildlife. Is that true?
Yes, absolutely true. It's a very recent phenomena that people are looking into urban ecology. And even in the beginning, when people were looking at urban ecology, they were mostly concentrating on the greenery in urban habitats. Maybe next would be water bodies, but nobody was really looking at animal behavior in urban ecosystems until maybe a decade ago. And there also people were mostly looking at conflict. So, how urbanization is reducing habitats, and which are the species which are dying out, which are the species which are capable of living here, but then, how is urban noise affecting bird song? So things like this. But for me, the urban ecosystem is just like a forest where I would be studying an animal. So for me, this is the urban jungle is just another jungle, and I don't want to look at just conflict or just cooperation. For me, it is like the whole life of the dogs is centered around here, and we are more and more interested in, also we are looking at the urbanization gradient, because it's not like a 1 or 0. Even rural areas are becoming more and more urbanized because a lot of vehicle traffic, more and more metal roads, less greenery. So there's basically an urban gradient, and how that affects the behavior of the dogs is quite fascinating.
How does it impact there?
So interestingly, in very crowded, very urbanized places, the dogs kind of laid back, not too disturbed by strangers, and quite easily they will come to you if you offer them food, because there's also a lot of competition. The density of dogs is higher. But in less urbanized areas where there are fewer people, less noise, the dogs are more wary of strangers. They are probably going to be better guard dogs because they are much more, aggressive when suddenly a stranger comes in. That's very fascinating for me, because probably even if I go back and think to 2000 years ago, when there were these dogs outside in the neighborhood and they would bark when a thief comes in, they were considered very useful for the people in the neighborhood, right? So it's more likely that these dogs are going to be playing that guard dog role a little more than dogs in the more and more noisy environment, because they're seeing strangers all the time.
And their barking might not receive as positive a response, right? People don't necessarily like the loud sounds. I know it's quite interesting who dogs form collectives with or relationships with in cities. They tend to, I know there's been some work done on how single women will often find connections with dogs for exactly this kind of guard. Having a dog nearby can be a protective measure for them as well. Loads of homeless folks also find themselves navigating similar geographies and spaces to dogs, and they find these kinds of loose collectives that are quite reaffirming for the people and the dogs involved, which is, there's just a world of information. And of course, you're looking at India, but you extrapolate this and you look at what's going on in Istanbul at the moment, which is quite devastating. And you can see how quickly an ecology can also change when the politics and the policies of a place change. The threats the dogs are facing have changed dramatically, right? In Istanbul, they're undergoing a pretty traumatic time right now.
Yes, absolutely. It's terrible, actually. But in India too, there's a lot of disturbance in the sense of there are a lot of people who really think that we shouldn't have dogs on streets. And I call it the, Western influence, because it's often that, people who have been educated in the West or have spent some time in the developed nations come back with this idea that dogs are pets and they belong to families and homes. And so there are two kinds who think that, okay, they just hate dogs. That's one set. And then the other set who really love dogs. And then they say, oh, the poor dog, it doesn't have a bed to sleep on. It sleeps on the streets. And what kind of a life does it have? It's very difficult to make them understand that it does have a life. It's this weird notion that, we have grown up seeing dogs on the streets all our lives. And then suddenly you start saying that, okay, there are no dogs on streets in America. Why do we need to have them on our streets? So I often say, okay, fine. In America, people don't throw garbage on the streets. In America, do you think that, more than half the population is struggling to get a meal a day. So, don't just compare your country with another country just based on something so superfluous. So think about the whole ecosystem, and this is how we have coexisted for centuries. And it's not just dogs in isolation, right? They are all connected. So there are dogs, there are cats, there are rats. So it's highly possible that if you remove all the dogs from a city, very soon you're going to be having a rat infested city, right? You cannot just think of one species in isolation. So it has to be the whole ecosystem that you're thinking about. Yes, we have a neutering policy, which I have very different thoughts about. But then even there we say you can only sterilize 70% of the population in a place, not 100. And the reason is that you need the population to still sustain. You don't want all the dogs to go away. You are saying, okay, they're multiplying at a very fast rate. I will reduce the population. But you cannot just say, I'm going to eradicate dogs from streets, and then don't give me the excuse that, oh, but poor dogs need to have a place to live. And that is why I'm giving them a good place to live. That's even worse than saying that I hate dogs.
I think we struggle a bit with the idea that there are many different ways to be dog, firstly, and that we spoke a bit about power moments ago, that there are various power dynamics and relationships happening in these varied ecologies, right? Like there are power dynamics still happening that are very unequal with pet relationships, very much so. And there are things like neuter and capturing policies that are also a type of power relationship and a governance response that dogs are having to respond to. And these are very different environments, both urban environments, but very different relationships that dogs are having to, and humans in these situations are responding to. And I really appreciate what you said there about thinking through the dynamism of the ecology, because even historically, you think about the cities where dogs are not as free roaming today, they were cities in which many animals were more free roaming, right? Pigs, horses, cows were often more in the streets. And when pigs were removed from Canadian cities, there was a huge spike in rat populations because pigs took away waste, right? Pigs were waste managers. So it's really an important point you raised there about thinking about the dynamism across species. I've mentioned oftentimes on the podcast and in my own work that we really have to disrupt this notion that cities are primarily or exclusively human places. But in fact, we need to disrupt the notion that they're exclusively or primarily any sort of individual species space. They are ecologies, and different species have various impacts on how they function. I want to just bring us briefly back to the theme of the season, which is multi-species health. So thinking about behavioral ecology and all of the types of observations it affords you when it comes to dogs and their relationships, how does it help us in terms of understanding or thinking through things like multi-species health?
Very important. So, dogs are well-known carriers of zoonotic diseases, right? So there's always this big question that, okay, there's a huge problem of rabies. So it's, the dogs are the major source. So, we have to do something about the dogs. Firstly, we have to understand that dogs are not the only source of rabies to begin with. You can get a bite from a monkey or a rat or a cat and get rabies, or a goat for that matter. So domesticated animals can also spread rabies, and this is something that we have to understand. Secondly, when we are talking about coexistence in the urban ecosystem, and as I say that there are many, many species which are together. So when we are thinking of multi-species health, it has to be firstly not just us and the dogs, but also other species. And we have to be really concerned about how the garbage that we are throwing out there can affect the health of all of these species which are utilizing this as a source of food. Because often, people unthinkingly would discard not just food, but with that, a lot of other stuff which can be poisonous for these animals. For example, medicines. If you are discarding medicines in the garbage with organic matter, not putting them separately out, and everything goes on. Sometimes maybe we do it, but then when the municipality is going and dumping everything in one place, there would be these big garbage dumping sites where you would see many species who are scavenging at the same place. And you don't know what all they are taking in, because there would be plastic, there would be glass, there would be medical waste, there would be sanitary waste, there would be food waste, and dogs and cats and pigs and goats and birds, all of them are scavenging there. And our garbage is eventually going to affect the health of multiple species simply through this act of disposal of waste, which is not being taken care of properly. Secondly, often people say that, okay, we have a very clean city. Why do we still have dogs? And yes, you have a clean city in the sense you don't have open garbage dumps. But then dogs don't just rely on open garbage dumps. They would go begging. They would sit outside, fish shops and meat shops and get fed. Or they will go to, people's houses and get fed with leftovers. And that is how they have survived for centuries. And that is okay. So, there are these multiple levels in which we have to understand behavior of species, because sometimes when we are doing management, often people are looking at only one aspect of, okay, this species is there, this species is not there, or this species is disturbing me and I don't like this species to be there, how can I curb it? But then we are not looking at the interconnectedness in the ecosystem. And that is where ecosystem understanding of how the species are interacting with each other, also how diseases flow from one species to another, that is also very, very important. So we really need to do more and more urban ecology studies where people look into different urban adapted species, they look into their ecologies, and we connect our data, do feedback for each other to understand what's happening.
I love how you connected kind of food waste and health there, because I know a couple of years ago there was this release of a report that found squirrels in North American cities were struggling with high cholesterol. And this blew people's minds. Like, what? Squirrels with high cholesterol? Because that seems to be a very human disease or domesticated animal disease, right? I know that cholesterol is a problem amongst some domesticated or pet dogs as well. But the truth of the matter is many urban squirrels are accessing trash cans where they're eating highly processed foods, and these highly processed foods impact their bodies and impact their health and their ability to reproduce and move through their environments in a healthy way. And in some ways, the high cholesterol in squirrels was a reflection on us and our own diets and some of the problematics we're introducing to our own lives in terms of health of lifestyle, health of environment. So in one way, it was a reflection on ourselves and our own health, as well as how our own actions can impact, in a very physical, material way, the health of others, even though they're making choices, right? And like you say, it's a difficult thing because you want to pry apart and give the animals agency. The squirrels and the dogs are doing very interesting dynamic things in finding places to get food, but they don't necessarily understand what highly processed food is, that it's going to have these health impacts, right?
Absolutely. In fact, my first student, she has moved on to work with Hanuman langurs in the urban habitat. And what they found, it was very interesting. There is this temple where there's a huge troop of langurs who constantly get food from people around who come to the temple. And they actually did this choice test and found that the langurs have started preferring buns over vegetables. So if you give them a choice of buns and peanuts and, brinjals and cauliflower, they actually take the bun first and perfectly fine fresh vegetables, but they prefer the bun. So, and that is high calorie food, right? But that's what they like. It's sweeter and it's high calorie, and they seem to have developed a taste for it. In fact, later, now they have done this fascinating set of experiments where they saw that these langurs are very good at begging. So they'll grab your hand or grab your leg and ask for food. And until you give them the food that they want, they'll not let you go. So, people are buying food from the vendors. So there are these people who sell food. And what they do now is these people will show these packets of chips and biscuits and stuff to the monkeys. And then the monkey will grab some customer and ask for food. And so now if the person tries to give them something that they don't want, they will not let go. They will not take that food item until they get that particular packet of chips that they're interested in. So imagine what we have done to them. Langurs who are craving for chips.
Yeah, so I mean, if these processed chips are impacting our bodies, there's no reason to assume that they wouldn't also be impacting the health of these other animals' bodies.
Yeah, I'm sure they are. And these are primates, right? So their bodies are very similar to ours.
And they're predisposed to sweet things like us. To another animal who I'd imagine is, and last question before we go to your quote, another animal who I imagine is really important to understanding dogs' urban ecologies in the context of India are leopards, because I know some of the highest populations of leopards in the world are no longer in what we'd imagine to be, quote unquote, the wild, but are actually in and around urban areas because of dogs. Dogs have become a really valuable prey for them. Is that the case?
That's in pockets, not everywhere, but in some cases. And again, it's because of this encroachment of urban areas into the forests that leopards have started coming into more urbanized areas and they have started hunting dogs. So this has happened in a couple of places. It's not like an India-wide situation, but it does happen. And it's like, if you actually talk to people in different localities, you hear of similar dynamics where either leopards or in some cases hyenas, they would come and kill dogs. So wild animals, for them, the dog would be a good prey.
So the encroachments into wild areas it's damaging wild areas, but it's also creating different kinds of urban animal politics and practices. Really interesting work. Do you have a quote ready for us?
Yep. So a very well-known quote, but I think I live by it. So Theodore Dobzhansky, one of the founding pillars of modern evolutionary synthesis, and he said that nothing in biology makes sense unless in the light of evolution. And I really believe that, because when I'm studying dogs, I'm not just studying dogs today, but eventually I would like to really understand, how dogs evolved into what they are today through their coexistence with humans. And I think the free-ranging dogs provide us that link between wild wolves or wolf-like animals to the pets. So they are the ones who are kind of in between, and understanding them, understanding their behavior, ecology, their abilities to interact with humans without training, all of that gives us that glimpse into the evolutionary past of what dogs could have been before we started interfering more and more into their lives. So that is the quote I have for you.
In some ways, I think it's what dogs are, right? Not just what they could have been. Like the street dogs are dogs. They are somewhat of a manifestation, not somewhat, they are a manifestation of what it means to be dog when you're not a captive pet necessarily. So is evolution a key? This is a key tenet of behavioral ecology. Is this saying that any behavior you see doesn't exist in a vacuum? It's been shaped and informed by histories of bodily and social change. So sociality is an important part of evolution here, right?
Yes. So for Dobzhansky, it was everything in biology. And that's true, right? Because we don't exist in the vacuum. Every species has its evolutionary history. Every individual has its developmental history. So you cannot just understand biology in the vacuum of just the question that you're interested in. So you really have to look at the evolutionary trajectory of how things came into being to understand what is there today and why it is there today. So behavior, I think it's all the more important, because when you're trying to understand a species' behavior, you cannot, again, look at it in isolation. You have to understand why a species behaves in the way it does. And that is where the evolutionary question comes in.
And is this the same as kind of saying, I'm very cautious and wary when the word instinct is pulled out, and maybe this is because I'm a social scientist, but sometimes I feel like instinct is mobilized in this way to make what are really complicated and interesting behaviors seem kind of, it's just instinct. But it seems deterministic or predetermined somehow. Is this the case when one is talking about evolution in animals and humans? How does that kind of tension work between thinking about predetermined or instinctual behaviors and the kind of responsiveness of animals?
So in behavior, we have very clear understanding of what is instinctive behaviors, where we say, okay, so without any prior training, without any prior exposure, when an animal is going to do a certain reaction, it is an instinctive behavior. For example, if an animal sees fire for the first time and runs from it, you would call that an instinctive reaction. But when you say, you give an animal a certain kind of food and it develops a liking for it, that is not likely to be instinctive. That is more like out of habit, or when it's first exposed, it likes the taste. And then with further exposure, it develops strong liking for that kind of food. That is something which is learned. It's not innate, it's not instinctive. So we have, and there are many ways in which behavioral biologists test things to be innate or learned. And then there is something we call as behavioral plasticity. So a behavior can be very fixed, that you will not be able to change this behavior no matter what you do. For example, a baby, when it's hungry, it'll cry. It's that natural response of the baby when it's hungry. It's not learned, it's innate, and it will cry if it's hungry. But for maybe an older kid, this, whether the child is going to ask for a cookie or going to ask for a heavier meal, it'll learn that all hungers are not the same, right? So I want a cookie kind of hunger, or I want a sandwich kind of hunger is different. And that is where you start learning. And your learning comes into effect. Even when there is hunger, you don't respond the same way. It is no longer that fixed response. On the other hand, when you have behavioral plasticity, the same animal or the same species can have slightly different responses to the same situation, depending on its learning of the past, maybe it's exposure to different, conditions, etc., etc. Where we call it that this behavior is plastic.
Okay, I see. So it's not necessarily that the reaction in that situation is instinctual. What's evolutionary here is our various ways in which we are plastic to situations. Some animals display maybe more plasticity than other animals, and that can be a product of evolutionary processes and practices. I'm with you. Well, thank you so much. This has been a really informative and interesting discussion. I've learned so much about dogs today. You've really expanded my brain in many, many ways. Thank you so much for the wonderful work you do in helping us to better understand these incredible creatures. What are you currently working on? And if people want to learn more about your lab and the work you do, how can they get in touch with you?
So currently we are working on many different things. Several of my students are doing projects connected to the human-animal interactions where they are trying to understand. So one big project ongoing right now is to understand their begging strategies. How do they beg? How often do they beg? Do they have, target particular individuals to beg from? What are the different behaviors they use to beg for food, etc. We are looking at their scavenging strategies, where we do different kinds of experiments to understand what kind of scavenging strategies they explore, how they reject some kinds of food which is unpalatable, how they strategize to get palatable food. We are looking at something very fascinating, which is their preference for color, because an initial set of experiments showed us that they seem to have a very, very special place for the color yellow. And now we are trying to understand why on earth yellow. So, and how strong is this preference? Another set of experiments that are ongoing are trying to understand the development of personalities based on the urbanization gradient, whether that affects the personality development of dogs. We have recently started working on their mating preferences and mating dynamics across groups. We are just beginning to work on their vocalization patterns and their territorial behavior. So there's a lot happening out there. And how to get in touch with us? We are on Facebook as The Dog Lab. I'm on Twitter. My Twitter handle is APHADRA7. I'm there on LinkedIn and ResearchGate. And we have a homepage. So if you just Google The Dog Lab, you'll find us. Or just write to me. I think, Claudia, you could probably share my contacts in your podcast when you do that.
I will. I'll put all of those details in the show notes. It sounds like you're doing really fascinating work. I love the stuff on sound. I know a lot of times we focus on dogs and their scent and their smell, so it's really interesting thinking through the different ways they identify one another, whether it's through smell or hearing as well. So really fascinating work. I'm excited to see what else comes from your lab. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Hi, Rashmi. Welcome back to the Animal Highlight. You've been telling us a bit about dogs in the Himalayan region. So who are we focusing on today?
So today I'll be talking about two dogs called Simru and Sheru. and they are the livestock guardian dogs. And I spoke a bit about livestock guardian dogs in my previous animal highlight. So these are dogs that accompany migratory shepherds when they take their livestock on long, arduous journeys through the Himalayan forest and the meadows. So they basically do a vertical migration yearly. And the shepherds set up camps in the alpine meadows. And dogs such as Simru and Sheru are tasked with guarding the camps and the animals against predation from predators like Tibetan wolves, snow leopards, brown bears, black bears. And I met and observed these dogs when I was living and conducting research on Himalayan livestock guardian dogs in the shepherd camps of these pasture of Himachal Pradesh, which is in India. And actually inspired by a conversation with Anindita about the behavioral ecology of free living dogs, especially in the urban Indian context. I thought I would tell you some of my observations of the behavior of dogs in rural India from the rural Indian context, especially on working dogs like Simru and Sheru. Simru is a miniature version of a Tibetan Apso or a Lhasa Apso kind of a breed. And her tiny body is covered with this shaggy ginger colored hair, which drapes over her eyes. And she also has like tiny beard all around her snout. And she trots with a speedy, light footed ease and is often accompanied by her 1 year old son, Sheru. Sheru is larger than Simru, although he's also a Tibetan Apso mix, and but his body is covered with an all white shaggy coat. Often, when we talk about dogs, we think of street dogs or pet dogs. But livestock guardian dogs like Simru and Sheru have lives that are markedly different. So during my 2 months of observations in these summer grazing pastures, I was interesting to see how much agency, mobility, and dare I say it, freedom dogs like Simru and Sheru experienced. To give more context to you, in India, shepherds establish temporary camps for themselves and their livestock in remote high altitude pastures for about 2 summer months because this is the time when the grass is of good quality and there's little precipitation in those higher reaches. And during the day, each shepherd will graze his livestock in the pastures close to his camp. And by night, the livestock will be brought back to be gathered and rest next to the camp itself. But the camp does not have, there are no fences around the camp. The livestock are not enclosed or walled up. They remain out in the open, just right next to the established camp. And each shepherd typically has traditional grazing rights and license over large areas of pasture lands, spanning several kilometer squares, where he is free to graze his livestock. Like the typical distance between any two shepherd camps would be about 6 to 8 kilometers of rough terrain, even more. I mean, at least it will be 6 to 8 kilometers. It could be a lot more as well. And one thing that's common is that another thing that's common is that each shepherd camp has livestock guard dogs with them. So typically, livestock guard dogs are expected to stay with their livestock, their shepherds, or their camps, and it is their duty to remain with or close to their own camp for providing vigilance or protection and guarding against intrusions or threats. But I often saw Simru and Sheru roaming in and around multiple shepherd camps far away from their own. And they seem to be engaging in these fairly cross camp visits to scent mark as much pasture as possible and make their own territory.
So, if I
Yeah.
understand you correctly, these two dogs were at a specific camp and they would travel several kilometers, so sometimes beyond 8 kilometers any given day to go to different camps and scent mark.
Yeah. Yeah, they
Wow.
would.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, I could share an example. So, like the both of them, the duo would enter other shepherd camps as if there were no other dogs guarding those camps in that territory, and the guard dogs in those camps would be, they would naturally bark at Sheru and Simru and challenge or question this wanton intrusion. And I mean, but nonplussed by these protests, Simru and Sheru would proceed to scent mark as much as possible. It seemed like they would leave no stone unscented. So some dogs would, continue to bark at the duo for this bold act of, territorial marking, but Simru and Shiru, they would continue with their activities undeterred, even defecating within the camp. And in my observations, I've pretty much always observed the guard dogs tend to go at least 100 or 150 meters away from their camps to, relieve themselves. And typically, these guard dogs never defecate within their own camps. In fact, I never came across any dog poop anywhere inside or close to the shepherd camp. So
Wow.
to see these two dogs, outsider dogs, doing their business inside other camps could, potentially be viewed as an open act of defiance or possibly even dominance. This attitude actually was also apparent in how these two dogs behaved with their own guard dogs, like their fellow guard dogs in their own camp. Sheru, for example, had a perpetual bone to pick with his fellow camp dog named Bhuru.
Mhm.
And whenever his mood would strike, Sheru would approach Bhuru with such silent hostility, and Bhuru would instantly resort to a submissive posture, lying on his back with legs curled in the air, tail tucked between the legs. And Sheru would stand atop him with such calm dominance, with confident upright ears, upcurled shaggy tail, and this behavior continued intermittently throughout my focal observations. And that is when I finally asked the shepherds about this behavior. So apparently Sheru and Bhuru were in a fight with each other earlier this year. And being the older dog, Bhuru challenged Sheru and made the grave mistake of biting him. And that was a mistake that has cost Bhuru his physical and mental peace even till the present day. So, like I was mentioning, so even though Bhuru was an older dog, and one would assume that he would, be the act dominant or, yeah, act dominant in the pack, but it seemed that Sheru wanted that position, or he wanted to be dominant among other dogs in the pack. And although they had these encounters, but funnily enough, the the unpleasant interaction between these two dogs, between Bhuru and Sheru, it was never really a fight or physically aggressive exchange. There was no barking, there was no growling, there was no sound involved. It was typically Bhuru would, be peacefully sleeping or resting, not hurting or minding a soul around. And Sheru would silently and confidently stalk up behind or right next to Bhuru. And as soon as Bhuru would sense Sheru's quiet presence, he would, move his body or his body parts away very slowly and very silently, trying to make himself as small as possible and as far away as possible from Sheru. And Sheru would then place himself abutting Bhuru in a very threateningly close proximity, which would result in Bhuru transforming himself into a statue in whichever awkward position that was agreeable to Sheru. And sometimes his head would be twisted and stretched away in the opposite direction, and sometimes the leg would be caught frozen midair. And he would attempt to get out of these uncomfortable positions at a painfully glacial pace, all the while ensuring that his movement does not inconvenience Sheru. And I have all of this like recorded on video, so it's really, I mean, I was feeling really bad for Bhurva at that time, but it was quite interesting and amusing to see this dynamic within a pack of dogs that are supposed to be from the same pack
Mm.
and should ideally be working together as opposed to working against each other.
Well, it doesn't sound like, I don't know, it's interesting. I mean, you've definitely spent more time with these dogs. I've never spent time with any garden dogs, but it seems like there's an establishing of rules happening, um, and a toleration. Because, like you said, there's never fighting, but it seems like they're trying to find ways to tolerate and work with one another, perhaps, not against one another. Is there scope to think of it that way?
I mean, I suppose so. I suppose there's a lot of dog politics that does go around even in these dog packs that we're not really
Yeah.
able to understand or certain with the tools
Yeah,
that we
yeah,
have.
of course. Yeah, it's always interesting because, like you said, he's not hurting him, but he's definitely bothering him. Um,
Yeah.
and what the goal would be, because he's obviously doesn't, like, he could chase him away if he didn't want him around. He could chase him away and say, "Well, don't come here," in a much more aggressive way. Um, yeah, it almost sounds like he's just messing with him. But I mean, it would be really fascinating to see these videos. It sounds interesting.
Yeah, it was really bullying because he would not leave Bhuru alone. He would just follow him wherever he went. And,
Shame.
yeah. But I mean, going by like the behavior of livestock guard dogs, even, I mean, this behavior was quite atypical of them, but that was not all. They also engaged in more atypical livestock guardian dog behavior. So, for instance, this mother son duo, they would also occasionally make night halts at other shepherd camps. And this is not something you would want your livestock guard dogs to do because it is at night when they are needed the most, to stay
Mm.
vigilant, to patrol the camp and alert the sleeping shepherds of any intruders. But this expectation did not stop them from having sleepovers at other shepherd camps nearby. And I've seen them spend nights in other camps on three different occasions, in three different camps myself. So, so the behaviors of this duo was quite curious and very unique. I did not observe them in other dogs that I was observing for my behavior study, and they were sort of defying the rules set for livestock guardian dogs by the shepherds. I mean, but however, I have to say that the shepherds seem to be passively tolerant of these defiant acts because these dogs were still really good at guarding their livestock at night.
Mm.
They were extremely watchful, very alert, around the camp even at night. And in fact, the tiny Simru, she would lead other bigger dogs, including Sheru, whenever there were wolves around to chase away. She would be the one leading and going about and uh, you know. So the shepherds did assure me that while Simru was in camp, there would be no intrusion of wolves. But they definitely wish that the two dogs would engage in fewer sleepovers. When we talk about multi species health, the behavior ecology of livestock guardian dogs, both typical and atypical, is a very relevant and an important matter because throughout their migratory journey between the high altitude meadows to the forests and the foothills, these guardian dogs constantly share space with other wild animals. And at the same time, they also ensure safety of their livestock flocks from attacks and injuries by other predators. At the same time, livestock guardian dogs can be thought of as, indirectly extending safety to the health of wild predators themselves. Because if it wasn't for the assured security that the shepherds have entrusted the dogs with, there would be increased dependency on other lethal means to prevent these wild animals
Mm.
from attacking or predating on livestock. So,
Wow, that's a really, really, I hadn't thought of that before. So that they'd probably start to like poison or try to hurt these other animals, kill them, shoot them. But the dogs
yeah.
act as a really effective deterrent so that these more lethal measures aren't needed. I hadn't thought of that. It's like using bees to keep away elephants. Instead of killing and hurting elephants that disrupt crops, increasingly people are
Yeah,
putting up beehives to stop the
yeah,
elephants in the first place.
yeah. And in fact, when it comes to the health of the dogs themselves, questions about autonomy and agency inevitably arise. But
Hmm.
unlike with pet dogs, whose choices are severely constrained by the desires of their owners, guardian dogs, especially ones as independent as Simru and Sheru, illustrate to what extent dogs might be able to experience and engage in independent decision making and movement. And this is not to suggest that they don't also experience difficulties, only to highlight that how, when left to their own devices, they engage in a range of complex behavior, not the least of which is an expansive geography of dog politics.
Excellent, super interesting. Yeah, I like that, an expansive geography of dog politics, because it does expand a huge area, and it's the politics with the shepherds, it's the politics with other dogs, it's the politics with the wolves. There's a lot going on in these stories. Very, very interesting. Well, thank you once again for a really incredible animal highlight. Thank you to Anindita Bhadra for being an amazing guest, to Jeremy John for the logo, Gordon Clark for the bed music, Rashmi Singh for the animal highlight, and Rebecca Shen for her design work. Thank you also to the Remaking One Health Indies project, the Row Indies project, as well as Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics, Apple, for sponsoring this episode. This episode was produced by myself and edited together with Christian Mintz. This is The Animal Turn. with me, Claudia Hurtenfelder.
For more great iROAR podcasts, visit iROARpod.com. That's iROARpod.com.